Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. Continuing our series on history, my guest today is Aymenn Al-Tamimi, who is a non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute in Washington, DC, and also a PhD student at the University of Swansea in Wales. His research focuses on historical narratives in Islamic State propaganda, which he regularly comments on in the media, as well as on the Syrian and Iraqi conflicts. He recently wrote an essay for New Lines about a 13th century text written in Latin called Historia Arabum, or The History of the Arabs, a text Aymenn has recently translated from its original Latin into Arabic. Aymenn described the author of this text, Rodrigo Ximénez de Rada, Archbishop of Toledo in Spain, and what this text tells us about attitudes towards Arabs in the period. In the process, he questions notions and definitions of tolerance, both then and now. Aymenn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you today.
Well, I'd like to start with an obvious question. Given your professional expertise and focus, that is on contemporary extremism and conflict, what led you to first discover and then translate such a long and difficult text written almost 900 years ago?
It actually, ultimately, it goes back to my childhood and actually to my university education, because my undergraduate degree was in classics of Oriental studies, and the main bulk of that was actually Latin literature and Greek literature and Roman history, ancient history. So, and I'd also studied Latin from my younger years prior to university. So I'd always had some familiarity. I'd long had some familiarity with Latin, and even as I graduated university and moved to working primarily on issues of contemporary extremism and groups like the Islamic State, I never entirely wanted to leave the world of Latin, in particular, behind the world of Latin language. And actually, in my one of the things I'd actually been interested in before I went to university as well, actually, was Latin translations of the Quran. So actually, since I was 16, actually, I've owned a copy of a Latin translation of the Quran that was done in the end of the 17th century. But actually, there were earlier translations before that. One of them having been done by an individual called Mark of Toledo in the 13th century. And I long wanted to get a copy of that book. It wasn't. I long wanted to get a copy of that translation, and it wasn't available in my younger years. But subsequently, a critical edition of it was published in 2016. So I started perusing it actually, and read the prologue. And there's the mention of this figure, Rodrigo, and how he'd commissioned this translation of the Quran into Latin. And of course, it was done with his own reason for wanting it commissioned. His own reason for wanting it to be done was that he wanted a basis for the refutation of Islam, and it was done out of hostility to Islam. Although the translation itself, which we could talk about if we wish, it is itself very interesting and somewhat generally devoid of polemics in how the translation was done. So really just one thing led to another, and then Rodrigo's works, I looked into them, having looked into this Latin translation of the Quran. I discovered that he'd written a work called the Historia Arabim, which really can actually be called the first Western book on Arab history. And I thought, well, this text looks interesting. I looked, and I think it merits a translation into Arabic, because I'd also long been interested in the idea of translating Latin texts into Arabic and trying to find people interested in publishing them. So I found a publisher in Jordan that was willing to take on that project at the start of 2021.
But that's a huge extra step. I can understand all the steps, leading to the interest, and that is a really fascinating kind of long-lived story. But the translation is difficult. First of all, the languages aren't particularly close to each other, and second, medieval Spanish Latin isn't very classical, and there's lots of difficulties with that. And you happen to have a very different professional life. Was there a particular question? Is there even perhaps a modern day question that you were seeking answers to when you chose to translate it?
Well, I wanted to see what the text was about. Was it really just how did this author conceive of Arab history, and how did he portray Arabs? And I had also there is also, I think, this wider interest I'd had in how the medieval Christian world saw Islam and Arabs. But this was really the first. This is one really stands out in at least in the Christian Europe as the first attempt to systematically write a book focused and study focused on the Arabs and their history.
Well, let's just actually pull back a little bit, as you say, like look at the medieval context in general, and just put Rodrigo into that intellectual context. In particular, what I'd just like to talk about is the translation movement that was happening in Europe in the 12th century. There was a huge amount of activity that was putting Arabic texts into Latin, and the same period sees the formation of the earliest European universities, and each of these had, as a matter of course, a chair of Arabic, because they knew that there was the thriving and active philosophical tradition that they could be tapping into. So books on logic, mathematics, metaphysics, natural sciences, lots and lots and lots of philosophy, many other topics were being translated into Latin. Of course, the lingua franca of Europe, which meant that they could be, and they were, disseminated widely through Christendom, which then triggered new centers of learning, new universities, even more translations from Arabic. So Rodrigo was really drawing on a large body of expertise already, wasn't he, in the form of his own education, which no doubt included Arabic sources, and further expositions and commentaries of those texts in Latin. Just for a bit of background, you probably don't know, I know all of this from my own work in translating a 10th century text from Arabic, which was Al-Farabi's Enumeration of the Sciences. Now, this text, it hadn't been translated into English before, but it had very good translations into Latin in the 12th century. Most notably, the ones I used were by Gerard of Cremona in Italy, and also Dominicus Gundersalinus, who was also working in Toledo. And their work was invaluable to me. They were very faithful to the original by Al-Farabi, but they were two quite different translations. So they gave me ideas of how to put some of the complex philosophy into a different grammatical form, because Latin's that much closer to English than Arabic is. But that's just an aside. Sorry, to get back to
No, it's a legitimate one. It's a legitimate point to raise, actually, that Toledo was this translation center, as it were, in the both actually in Rodrigo's time and before it. And this translation of the Quran into Latin produced at Toledo. You could say perhaps it's one of the major works of translation put out there in the 13th century. What is, though, distinct, or what is interesting, though, is that, as you'd actually mentioned, a lot of these works that were translated from Arabic into Latin, they concern subjects like philosophy, sciences, mathematics, but actually we don't find one that's a translation of an Arabic historical work into Latin. I mean, among the various titles that are mentioned that are translated, we don't find one that's that's a history book, and that's actually, I think, what makes Rodrigo's work, Historia Arabum, actually stand out from the other work from the wider translation movement. Because there's no doubt he used Arabic source material for the or information coming from Arabic historical sources for his Historia Arabum.
Yeah, but he went further, I suppose, than simply being informed and educated by the Arabic sources that the translation movement produced, because he was also interested in the culture they were coming from, right? Because that's what we see it in his commissioning the translation of the Quran or his own work on Historia Arabum. And these things, of course, don't necessarily go together. You know, there are many places around the world today where the products of Western technology are welcomed, but the values of the culture they come from are rejected. So Rodrigo, in being interested in the source culture, was he unusual for his time?
Yes, and it is remarkable at all, even to I think firstly, even to just use Arabic source material for his writing of history. There was really actually only one. There's really only one other parallel you could perhaps think of from that time, which from the medieval time, but it wasn't actually in the West. It was what I'd called in the Latin East. By the Latin East, I mean the Crusader states that were established in the Levant. There was this author called William of Tyre, who wrote, he's best known for this Latin chronicle he did about the history of the Crusades. But he also actually mentions having used Arabic sources himself for writing a history from the time of Muhammad up to, I think it was around 1184. And in that, actually, he named his most prominent source as an Arabic chronicle written by a Christian patriarch in Alexandria. Now, unfortunately, however, that work, which people often conventionally refer to as the deeds of Eastern leaders, that work actually is not extant, and it's very difficult to know really the scope of it. So what I mean by that, it's very difficult to tell if that work was specifically about Arabs or whether it was more a general Middle Eastern history that, say, would have covered things like the rise of the say the Seljuk Turks in the Middle East. With Rodrigo's work, I suppose there's an additional perhaps distinction with Rodrigo's work, that it just seems as though the information from the extant materials we have, it seems the information he was drawing on, it was coming from the Arab Muslim historical works, and not simply, say, relying on an Arabic Christian source. So that's even more remarkable, I would say, especially given his hostility to Islam.
Well, yes, there's the tension that I'm sensing. You know, you mentioned in the prologue to the Latin translation of the Quran that it was for very polemical reasons, that it was commissioned for polemical reasons to refute Islam. But then you mentioned that maybe it was less polemical in its substance than what had come before.
Yeah,
but
could I talk about that actually, just a bit about what I mean by not the substance of that translation not being so polemical?
Yeah.
Yeah. Firstly, the way that translation is done, it's very it tends towards literalism, and it's generally faithful to the original text. And also, I think what you can tell from looking at the translation, because the Quran is not the easiest text to translate. I mean, it does have poses linguistic difficulties and obscurities, even for the Muslim exegetical tradition. But this is clearly someone who thought very carefully about the text and its meaning, and tried to convey it, tried hard to understand it and convey it. And you especially, I think, see that when you look at some of the more obscure terms in the Quran and the way Mark of Toledo tried to render them. One example that I remember quite well when I was looking through it was there's this word ababil, which in one of the ending Surah Al-Fil, one of the late chapters of the Quran, which conventionally people understand that conventionally it's interpreted as flocks or groups of birds. But Mark of Toledo actually he rendered it as birds of Babylon. And I think he was thinking Ababil must be linked to Babel, so must mean birds of Babylon, which is, I mean, that's not I mean, that's not someone who's that's not really the approach of someone, I think, who's trying to say distort the text deliberately or to portray Islam in as bad a light as possible. He's really thinking
Right.
hard about what it's trying to say, and some people have suggested actually that Ababil is what is later in suggestions that Ababil means birds of Babylon. So yeah, I just wanted that as an aside by what I meant by the way that
Yeah.
the text is the translation that was done was devoid of polemical intent, and the way it was done, but the
Yeah.
intention of commissioning the project was polemical, yes.
Well, then, if we go to Historia Arabum from that context, I mean, you're saying that he's unusual for going back to directly to Arab sources, but at the same time, there is a marked hostility. But can you tell us a little bit about the text? I mean, it was part of a longer series, right?
Yes, it wasn't this standalone work that was composed. I think most scholars today actually recognize that it's essentially what Rodrigo did. The last major work of his life was to compose this what essentially is a 5-part series that can be called A History of Spain. And the bulk of it is what was called the Gothic history, because Rodrigo, like many others in medieval Spain, they saw this continuity, a supposed continuity between the Christian kingdoms that arose after the Muslim conquest and the prior kingdom of the Visigoths, who ruled Spain before the Islamic conquest. So that's the main work that he composed, and it seems the final edition of that was done around 1243. But then he composed these supplement works, which essentially tried to help intended to help the reader understand more how foreign peoples contributed to the history of Spain. So the second work is the history of the Romans, and that's only a prologue and 10 chapters long. And then he does the history of Huns, Vandals, Alans, Suevi, and Silingi. And when I was doing my article for the New Lines, I simplified it a bit because the Huns didn't actually invade Spain, but Rodrigo, I think, mentions them because of their role in the displacement of so-called barbarian tribes in the 5th century, and including peoples who migrated to Spain, like the Vandals, Alans, and Suevi. And all of those were eventually displaced by the Visigoths. And then he does the history of the Ostrogoths, and that's a very, very tangential connection. He only does it because there was just this brief period where the Ostrogoths, who ruled out of Italy, briefly, under Theodoric the Great, the territories of the Visigoths in Spain were united under one entity. But then finally is the Historia Arabum, which is actually much, much longer than any of the other supplementary books that Rodrigo composed. It's actually a prologue and 49 chapters long, whereas, say, something, as I mentioned, the history of the Romans, that was only just a prologue and 10 chapters.
So he
History of
was
the Huns
very,
was a prologue and 16 chapters, and the
oh yeah,
Ostrogoths was just a
he was,
prologue and 6 chapters. So it's really, it's such, these Historia Arabum's length is really such that you can almost just consider it a standalone work, even as you
yeah.
recognize it as part of the bigger History of Spain project.
Yes, so he was very, very interested in the Arabic period of Spain. And now we get to the heart of it all then. Just how do the Arabs emerge from Rodrigo's telling of their history?
Well, given the opening, you would think that really it's a non-ending story of destruction and calamity. I mean, to be clear, actually, Rodrigo, in that impression he gives in the prologue, I mean, it's not unique. It's not as though he necessarily thinks the Arabs are uniquely evil in the destruction they bring, or that they have the monopoly on the destruction that was brought to Spain. I mean, similarly, for instance, he sees the Romans as having brought what he calls judgments of death on Spain. And certainly when he writes, say, the history of the Romans, for instance, it's not about, oh, the Romans were so great and they brought civilization to Spain. No, it's actually, he focuses very heavily on, in his history of the Romans, on the massacres and warfare that occurred between, say, the Romans and the Carthaginians in Spain. the conquests of Spain by the Romans and the destruction that brought. So I mean, just to be clear, so the impression given in the prologue for the history of the Arabs, it is one of a story of calamities and destruction. But I think that's part of also, to an extent, that's part of Rodrigo's wider view of history, which is not an entirely illegitimate one, that history is full of massacres and warfare and destruction and a lot of human suffering.
Yes.
But given even within the Historia Arabum, with that negative impression that comes from the prologue, and which he reinforces by how he says he's going to outline the biography of Muhammad to uncover the cunning and savagery of that people, and people should be aware of these false stories Muhammad concocted and this poison-bearing pestilence-bearing poison he put in the minds of lustful souls. There's that negative impression, but then as time goes on, as it goes on with the book, it becomes more and more objective in general, such that you can really say there's an inconsistency between the prologue and much of the bulk of the content of the Historia Arabum.
So yeah, again, we've got that tension coming up. I mean, I going back to his view of the history and politics, one thing that you make clear in the essay is that he seems to see it as a zero-sum game, the human politics. And I'll quote from the prologue as to why I say that. He says, just as from the beginning they, that's the Muslims, oppressed the Christian inhabitants under the burden of tribute, so also they now live in accustomed servitude under tribute following the restoration of the fortifications to the Christian leaders. So in that kind of sense that somebody's in charge and somebody's oppressed, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what coexistence in medieval Spain might look like here.
Yes, I mean, what should actually be made clear from the context of this also is that Rodrigo wasn't just writing history and divorced from the worldly affairs of Spain. No, he was very actively involved in it during the peak of his career, and specifically he was involved in Crusader campaigns in Iberia against the Muslim powers, so specifically in particular against the Almohad Caliphate that was ruling much of southern Spain at the time. And Rodrigo himself participated in a battle in the year 1212 alongside Alfonso VIII of Castile, what's called the Battle of Las Navas de Tuloso, which was actually a decisive defeat against the Almohads. And so important did Rodrigo see that battle that in that same prologue from which you quoted, he mentions that from the time of that battle, to quote, the sword of the Arabs has been blunted and the Gothic strength has been restored. The Gothic strength, of course, referring to Christian power. I think that it's a fair interpretation to argue that Rodrigo himself, given his career and given, I think, his wide and negative portrait of Arabs and Muslims, that I think in the end you could reasonably argue that his goal, that he wanted to see an end of Muslim sovereignty in Spain. So Muslims controlling and administering territory in Spain. It's fair enough to say he wanted to see an end to that. But from that same excerpt you quoted, it's also clear that he could want to see an end of Muslim sovereignty, but he was also perhaps be happy to, quote unquote, tolerate the Muslims in Spain, provided that they're subject to Christian power, and that they're in a subordinate status and paying tribute to the Christian rulers.
Yeah, and I mean, he specifically writes about Spanish Arabs, right? He sees them as an integral part of Spain.
Yes, not only that, he uses another interesting formulation at the very end of the work, the Vandal Arabs, which does not mean causing destruction, but is coming from an etymology for Al-Andalus that supposedly derives from the term from the name Wandalia, so the realm of the Vandals, given that that tribe settled in parts of in parts of Spain during the 5th century. So by using that term, it essentially, you can argue that it's recognizes a distinction between them, the Arabs of Spain, and say Arabs of the Middle East, or say the Berbers of North Africa, and elsewhere too. There's this distinction raised between regarding, say, the Berbers and the Arabs. It's not all just one big morass of Saracens or Hagarenes, and as he's referring to some of these common terms that were used in medieval times for the general mass of Muslims. No, he clearly does, I think, see distinctions. But yeah, I would say this is an example of where you could see oppression and coexistence being together at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah, because as you noted, just as they oppressed the Christians from the beginning, now they're the ones who have to pay tribute to us. And not only that, but before that also, as I mentioned, the Battle of Las Navas de Tuloso, and how Rodrigo saw that as a turning point. He also mentions how it opened the way of revenge for the Christians. So it's almost retaliation for oppression.
Well, and it's also making me think about something else, and this might be a terrible analogy, you can tell me, but if you think about southern Spain under first Arab rule, it might have felt to the Christians a little bit like colonialism did in the 19th and 20th centuries, in that the rulers might be hated, the sense of being a second-class citizen hugely resented, but at the very same time, the dominant culture could be admired for its superior thought and technology. Which, of course, the Latin translation movement showed how admired they were. But just the amount of resources poured into the translation of Arabic text tells us that. Can you recognize anything in that analogy?
Actually, that's one that I didn't really think of in depth, but I think it's actually quite a good one. Because
Right.
actually, also among some of the other Latin works that I've translated into English, maybe at some point do an Arabic translation in the future, but scholars actually have collected writings of 9th century Spain in particular. They're compiled under what's called the corpus of Mozarabic writings. Mozarab is a common term that's used to refer to Christians living under Muslim rule in Iberia during this period and beyond. But it can also be misleading. I mean, there were Christians who adopted Arabic language and culture and fully participated without converting to Islam. And no doubt they could perhaps be seen as important in contributing to, say, later translation and movements that arose. On the other hand, though, from the extant what we call Mozarabic writings from this 9th century, the Christians who are writing in Latin, they're very much the opposite of that, in that they actually strongly urge against Christians not to adopt the Arabic culture and language. For instance, one of the writers in that collection, Alvaro of Cordoba, he's actually well known. He wrote this long essay called Indiculus Luminosus, which tries to claim Islam as the Antichrist. And at the end of it, he actually sees the prevalent use of Arabic language as one of the signs of the beast of Revelation, and he laments how he says, "Oh, Latin's been forgotten, and we now see these Christians writing in Chaldean writing. Chaldeans, he's using that as a term for Arabs." I think he's trying to link them, I think, to Babylonians in biblical literature. But yeah, this is interesting that, yeah, many Christians may have perhaps resented the second-class status, and you also see that in those same writings. But nonetheless, I think there was also participation in the system. There was adoption of Arabic language and culture and writing. And the fact that you see some Christians complaining against that and insisting on retaining a Latin identity and culture, I think very much does speak to a high degree of Arabization, as it were. Even though, say, for someone like Rodrigo, he wouldn't have considered these Mozarabs, who actually many of them retained a distinct identity in Toledo, even after it came under Christian rule, so distinct from other Iberian Christians. he wouldn't have really actually seen them as Arabs. He actually uses at one point in the Gothic history another term for them. He calls them mixed Arabs, but he doesn't mean Arab by racial descent. He just means that they lived among the Arabs and adopted aspects of Arab culture. But he doesn't actually, as you can see from Historia Arabum, he doesn't see most Arabs as Arabs. He actually just really applies that to Arab Muslims.
So you're talking about a lot of cultural sharing and even assimilation. And I wondered if we could, and we see this in a lot of different ways. There's also throughout the history of mathematics, you look at the number system in southern Spain over these centuries, and you see them really kind of wandering around before they settle on the Latin number system. We've got something called Gothic, which is something halfway between Arabic and what we end up with in the modern number system, which we call Arabic, but they're not Arabic. And you see all of this kind of happening between the different cultures, the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs, and then the European Christians. You see it in the business arrangements, and sharing and developing new systems and thoughts. So there was definitely an element of intellectual sharing and debate and discussion that was very productive. So what do you think? I mean, I suppose gesturing to what you said about oppression and coexistence existing side by side, what does all of this have to say about tolerance at the time?
Really, the tolerance, I think, it has to be understood as a relative concept. And there's also this other common term that's used for the medieval Spain describing the arrangements that were in place, convivencia, living together, right? And it's not as scholars understand it, it's really not this conception that everyone lived in harmony and respected each other's religion and got necessarily all got along. It's more like accepting the existence of these other communities, whether you like them or not, and finding some way of living with them. But that could also doesn't mean necessarily equal rights before the law. That effectively means, I think, one group exerting its authority over the others. So whether, say, in Christian Spain, in Rodrigo's time, it's essentially Christian authority over Muslims and Jews. And you see that actually effectively in Rodrigo's interactions with, say, for example, the Jewish community of Toledo. I mean, the Central Catholic leadership, I think, wanted to impose some harsher measures on the Jewish community, and say in terms of dress and in payment of tithes. But Rodrigo actually he came up with effectively a poll tax system for the Jewish community of Toledo that can be seen as analogous to the jizya, or a poll tax system that Muslims imposed on Jews and Christians under their living under their rule. And so it's really that relative sense in which tolerance has to be understood. And I actually want to speak. I want to speak up in defense of scholarship. I think because I think that of particularly modern scholarship. I think because I think it's not fair to characterize somehow modern scholarship as all being blind by supposed political correctness and thinking that Andalus was this multicultural, equal rights for all paradise for people. No, I think the scholarship correctly understands it to be a relative meaning of tolerance and not the sense of tolerance as we'd understand it today.
Well, I do wonder whether we could reflect a bit on what all of this means for us today, because, and in terms of difference, I think a key difference between now and what you've described as Rodrigo's attitude is a certain form of cultural respect. So in medieval Arab Spain, a Christian might be treated like a second-class citizen in many ways, legally, economically, through the jizya, or socially as well. And there might be real animosity about all of that. And conversely, an Arab under Christian rule or Jew, as you've just described, paying a poll tax. And there might be, injustice around that. But there was there remained a core respect for the Muslim culture that gave rise to the Muslim rulers, seen in the translations and the attention to their history and philosophy, like the Historia Arabum. Whereas today in the West, Muslims aren't officially treated as second-class citizens, and by that I mean they don't pay extra taxes and they don't have different laws applied to them. But I think the ideas of Islam aren't so widely respected or valued. Is that a fair characterization, do you think?
But on the other hand, though, it's one thing to say that the Christians of the medieval times respected Arabic outputs, say, of science and philosophy. But on the other hand, there wasn't really respect for. There wasn't, in general, I say this in general, there wasn't really respect for Islam as a religion. I think you do see that in Rodrigo's work. On the other hand, though, I mean, Rodrigo, I think, stood out from some of the other medieval writers, that he didn't see Islam as this Christian heresy. He saw it as a false religion and as a false sect. He commonly uses the word sect in the Historia Arabum when he's describing, when he's referring to Islam, say the sect of Muhammad, and subjugated to the sect of Muhammad, and referring to some of the early Muslim conquests in Egypt, for example. But no, so he is hostile to Islam, and I suppose there is that parallel with today. So there might have been respect for again, scientific and mathematical output, but and contribution to knowledge in that regard, but not necessarily respect for Islam. Sometimes though, I do have to mention this, you do find that some medieval Christian authors, to try to prove truth of Christianity as they saw it, they would sometimes leap on the Quran and highlight bits where Islam speaks positively about Jesus, for instance, or accords great status to the Virgin Mary. And there was even this one author of from the Latin East, actually, William of Tripoli. He actually he leaped on that, and actually apparently he tried to use that as a conversion strategy aimed at Muslims, highlight the common ground between Islam and Christianity and the respect accorded, say, for instance, to the Virgin Mary, and then correct Islam's errors about the status of Jesus, in the hope of trying to bring over the Muslims to Christianity. That was one example I've come across. But no, today, so actually, in a way, but to go back to the point and be in short, you could see a parallel still between hostility to Islam today and hostility to Islam back in those times. I think it's still there. Yeah.
Well, these things are tricky to navigate, aren't they? Because these definitions and these concepts, coexistence, tolerance, they're so dependent on cultural attitudes and beliefs. It's very tricky to write about from a culture that's so far removed in time and attitude. I mean, is there anything more you can say, do you think, about tolerance to Muslims, bearing in mind what you've said about hostility to their ideas, yet attention to their culture? How do you think Rodrigo saw tolerance to Muslims?
He saw it in terms of, I think, a second class status. At the same time, as you can see in so overall, he wants them, I think, in a second class dhimmi-like status towards Christian authorities. But I think you see with the Historia Album, as it becomes more objective, you see actually by objective, you see even, say, words of praise that are given to various Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus that really is inconsistent with the portrayal he initially gave in the prologue of 532 years and beyond of destruction. For instance, I mean, he speaks of one of Hisham I as governing the whole land with justice. He mentions Al-Hakam I, as one of the Umayyad emirs in Cordoba, as having he personally judged the poor. That's the literal way the phrase is rendered. But I think what he means when you compare with Arabic source materials, that he passed judgments favorable towards the poor. and he also worked to keep the criminals and delinquent people in check. You even say Yusuf bin Tashfin, who was the Almoravid king who destroyed the Taifa kingdoms and halted the Christian advances in Al-Andalus in a battle, the Battle of Zalaqa, which is still commemorated by jihadist groups today. Actually, Rodrigo says about Yusuf bin Tashfin that he ruled, he preserved justice for all. So even though he has a negative view of Islam as a whole, and I think of Muslims as a whole, it wouldn't have prevented him from preventing him from seeing in, say, positive portrayals of Muslim rulers in source material, and preventing him from believing in those portrayals, and therefore reproducing them in his own work. You see, as I did mention in the article discussing it, that one argument against one of the arguments in the tolerance debate is, well, Rodrigo might offer words of praise for Muslim rulers, but that's just the result of him uncritically copying his Arabic source material. But I think it's fair to say, in contrast, in reply to that, is that yes, he might be copying. He might be, but why suppose that he doesn't believe that the portrayal in his source material is true? So if he writes something in praise of one of the rulers, and he's just drawing that from Arabic source material, should we suppose that he doesn't believe that? I think that's not. I don't think that's a reasonable argument to make.
No,
I think he genuinely believes the praise he offers for these. He genuinely believes those words of praise he offers for those Muslim rulers.
So do you think that you might understand this text in a particular way because of your work on contemporary intolerance?
I mean, I didn't draw the link with jihadism when I was or jihadist portrayals of Al-Andalus and Andalusian history when I was looking at this work. I did, though, have in mind issues of, say, some contemporary context. I mean, I mentioned it in passing in the end, right, with the places where coexistence might be held up or put on display, but it's really it shouldn't be obscure the reality of the oppression, say, that does exist. For instance, in the Israeli-Palestinian context that I was thinking of, were instances, I think, where, say, Israeli settlers might uphold examples of where they interact on day-to-day basis with Palestinians. They might do activities together, they might employ Palestinians for certain functions, but it doesn't, I think, change the bigger picture of the arrangement that's in the occupied West Bank, which is that it's a second-class, it's overall second-class status for Palestinians as a whole living in that territory, even if they do have economic and social interactions with the Israeli settlers. That was really what I had in mind when I was thinking of those present-day analogies.
Those between coexistence and oppression.
Exactly, that the tension, and they can be together at the same time. So.
Well, just to finish up, I'd like to ask what's in the future for you. Would it be more ISIS, more medieval Latin, or both?
Oh, I'm translating right now, actually. Well, I think it'll be both. I'm translating right now, though, the Gothic history of Rodrigo into English. So over a third of the way through that right now. And
oh, so you are retaining your commitment to Latin sources?
Oh yeah, I'm not giving up on that. It's I think it'd be a great shame if I just went entirely over and just focused only on one thing. I like to maintain maintain a variety of interests.
Well, good luck with that translation. It sounds epic. And Aymenn Al-Tamimi, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
You can buy Aymenn's Arabic translation of Historia